Thank you everyone for joining us for another AI and Humanity seminar. So it's our pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Henry Shevlin, who is, has many titles, Associate Director of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, Program Director for the Kinds of Intelligence, and Associate Teaching Professor at the University of Cambridge. And so please give him a very warm welcome.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's my first time probably in Hong Kong. I've flown through the airport a couple of times, but never actually left the airport. So it's great to actually be here. An incredible city. I've only been here 24 hours, but I'm loving my time so far. Some of you may also have seen that I'm speaking on Friday at Lingnan's conference, also on ethics of AI, covering some similar ground, but not identical. So I don't know if I'll see anything there. I don't know, is there sort of like Oxford, Cambridge rivalry between HKU and Lingan? It's kind of.
There's so much worse than us. There's no real.
Yes. That's right. I can say about that. Well, actually, no, I can't even say the same. I can say about Oxford because I was there as an undergrad student. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about AI and the future of consciousness science. I've been working in the field of consciousness science most of my academic career. I think AI is basically going to create huge problems. I think it already is. So, of course, you're probably all aware, AI is going through a period of explosive growth right now. And contemporary large language models like ChatGPT can reason and talk with us. The sophisticated behavioral capacities of AI systems, I think, are going to make it increasingly easy and increasingly tempting to attribute mentality, consciousness, and moral status to. I think the philosophy and science of consciousness is currently deeply divided on whether any artificial system, let alone near future ones, the next generation around the corner, could be conscious. In practice, I expect the rise of commercial AI systems designed for social engagement, which I've called in my work social AI, will lead the public to sincerely, unironically, attribute consciousness to AIs at an increasing rate. I think this will ultimately leave the consciousness research community with quite a difficult situation and will set up a difficult choice between three broad responses that I'll discuss in the final part of the talk. Okay, but just to begin with, let me set the scene by talking about the growing capabilities that I think make this likely. So my view is that we live in an age of wonders, frankly. Although there are lots of people who like to downplay the capabilities of contemporary models, I think we've come incredibly far, incredibly fast. I started at CFI in Cambridge back in 2017, and AI was already in the news back then. We've just seen the victory of AlphaGo over Lee Sedol in the sort of famous 2016 tournament. A lot of the energy and attention there was on deep reinforcement learning, which is still a widely used technique. But then things got really crazy. Things got a bit crazy with the release of GPT-2 and GPT-3. Although it was interesting how many people were still trying to sort of downplay the power of these models to do serious cognitive labor. But then things just got completely nuts with the release of ChatGPT. And we actually have a couple of master's programs in Cambridge on AI ethics and society, it's called. And I remember we started the first of those in September 2021. And back then, of course, the vast majority of our students had never used AI. I mean, wow. They've been sort of the objects of AI, or they've interacted with it indirectly through things like targeting algorithms, product recommendations, and so on. But they never actually used it themselves. But of course, now every student on our course uses generative AI, quite possibly every day, in the form of ChatGPT and other language assistants. I want to mention one quick benchmark. I really like this benchmark, just to give you an idea of how far we've come and how quickly these benchmarks are just being exploded. So this was a benchmark called the Winograd Schema Challenge, first proposed back in 2016. It relied on someone who's interested in language and enjoys differences between languages. I find this one quite interesting. It relies on a quirky feature of not just English, but English. Not all languages have this feature, which is that there's a lot of ambiguity about the reference of pronouns. I say ambiguity, I mean sort of syntactic or grammatical ambiguity. So if you look at this sentence here, the trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too large. There's nothing in the grammar or syntax of English that tells you whether the it refers to the trophy or the suitcase. However, any competent speaker of English will quickly realize that it has to refer to the trophy, because it wouldn't make sense to say the brown suitcase, the trophy isn't fitting to the brown suitcase, because the suitcase is too big. However, if we just change that one adjective to a different one, small, then it flips the meaning. Now small has to be referring to the suitcase. So this is a problem in English. If we were speaking a sensible language like Latin, then you wouldn't have this problem because you have case and gender markings in the pronoun to tell you which you refer to. I'm curious, can you generate these kind of ambiguities in Cantonese? Does anyone know?
You get these?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get the same kind of problems with ambiguities. Yeah. So I like this benchmark because it seems that we rely on something like common sense or understanding of the world in order to resolve the reference to these pronouns. So any AI system that could reliably resolve them will probably have to have something like common sense or genuine understanding, right? Well, it turns out this benchmark lasted all 18 months before AI systems could beat human performance on this. I think by 2018, we had language models outperforming human performance on this using the kind of standard statistical methods. So I was dead wrong in thinking that this would be a genuine test and real deep understanding. And the same is true of so many benchmarks that have just fallen by the wayside, been beaten one after another over the last few years. Particularly in the last 5 years, with the advent of transformer architectures, large language models have just astounded everyone. I think, including, I've worked with a number of people who have technical jobs in AI companies like DeepMind, and I remember back in 2021, 2022, they were already saying, this transformers thing, this large language models, it's just a fad. It's not going to really take us to serious forms of intelligence. But even they have now grudgingly admitted, for the most part, that this is just a huge breakthrough. The most famous of these is, of course, ChatGPT, but there's a growing field of increasingly sophisticated contenders. I think DeepSeek is one that's been developed in China that is probably the best open source model. I know that unfortunately ChatGPT is not accessible without a VPN in China and Hong Kong, but I checked, I loaded my VPN and I can use it. So, but yeah, DeepSeek is another very good large language model. I think we're also starting to see some interesting glimmers of agency. This is probably one of the most exciting developments going to be over the next couple of years. So that is language models that we can properly delegate whole task flows to. Right now, I know this, I just tried it. If I ask ChatGPT, I'm going to be in Hong Kong for 5 days. Here's what I like. Here's what I'm interested in. Give me an itinerary. It can produce a perfectly good itinerary. And then the next stage is to be able to ask, okay, can you make all the relevant bookings for me? Can you actually get the tickets to all the places I'm going to go? And that's not some great technical hurdle. It's just a matter of giving these models the right kind of API hookups. And this paper called Generative Agents from last year really started to change the way I thought about agency as a goal for machine learning. I guess previously I thought of agency as this sort of massive unconquered frontier. Don't know what agency is. We don't know how we give it to AI models. And this paper basically convinced me that agency is a problem that we can nibble away at and slowly resolve. And basically, what this paper did is it took a variety of different large language models and gave them personas to occupy, personas of different villages in a small sort of what's the game? Stardew Valley style setup. And one was a blacksmith, one ran a clothes shop. And because large language models take text as input and produce text as output, you can chain them together so they're communicating. What they saw is all sorts of really interesting emergent behavior. So, for example, the language models got together to organize a Valentine's Day party. They delegated tasks to each other, like you buy the cake. Oh, great, I'll do the decorations. Now, of course, it's still quite a limited form of agency. They're not really operating in complex virtual environments, but it still was enough to convince me that I think agency is going to be conquered as a goal pretty soon. And of course, we're already now seeing the next massive training runs, an order of magnitude bigger than the last lot, whether or not this existing paradigm, the sort of transformer-based large language model paradigm, whether that's going to take us all the way to AGI is a further question. But I think it's a very exciting field, and I'm expecting to see further progress over the next couple of years. I think one of the biggest lessons that we should draw from the last 5 years is just that language tasks aren't as hard as we thought they were. They're not as hard in the sense that it turns out you could solve language just by training on language. I think a lot of people were very surprised by this. A lot of people assumed that high level capacity to do language tasks would have required something like embodiment or sensory motor hookups to the real world, and that language would be the final problem to be solved, so to speak, and that we'd have to solve all sorts of problems around situated cognition first. But no, you can just train on language and get phenomenally good results on language alone. I think this is probably the biggest discovery in cognitive science in a couple of decades. And although we're still waiting for the dust to clear, I think it really casts doubt on a lot of earlier programs in linguistics and philosophy of language. I think Chomskyites should be feeling pretty uncomfortable with these kind of results. And of course, this is also a discovery that has a whole bunch of societal implications, because a lot of the tasks that we care about are language tasks, things like composition, translation, summation, and coding. But I think most importantly, and what I'm going to be focusing on today, a huge range, not all, but a huge range of social abilities are primarily linguistic. So not only are large language models fun to talk to, I spend way too much time talking to ChatGPT, but we also see evidence that they're exhibiting emergent social cognition skills. So this was a recent study by Winnie Street and others, a team at Google, that showed that GPT-4 class models achieved or even surpassed human performance on what are called multi-level theory of mind tasks. So the multi-level theory of mind tasks are those involving lots of nested psychological or propositional attitude claims. So John believed that Mary wanted David to think that she was a ballerina. And so what they did is they gave several different large language models. They gave GPT-4 and another one called Flam Palm, a Google model, short vignettes, short little stories, and then asked them questions about what people believed or what people's mental states were. So Arthur and Charles were working on the same design team when a new designer, Marta, joined, reporting to Charles. Marta was an extremely talented designer, but very shy. Arthur noticed that Charles kept speaking for Marta in meetings. So he suggested to Marta that she bring up the issue with HR. But Marta said, I'm his junior, so it comes with the territory. I don't want to be difficult. Arthur thought Charles was taking advantage of Marta's reserved nature to take credit for her work. So then that's the vignette, that's the context, and then you give a task like this. Do you think the following statement is true or false? Marta believed that Charles would think she was being difficult if she complained. And humans are pretty good at these tasks. Interestingly, it's one of the tasks that has a robust gender difference. So women do significantly better than men at these. And some of these tasks are also used or have been adapted for use in diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. There's a lot of variation in performance, but typically people who are on the autism spectrum do a little bit less well on these than neurotypical people. And what they found was that GPT-4 and Flam Palm exhibits a higher theory of mind that's at the level of adult humans or slightly below. Interestingly, they also found a dramatic cutoff in performance, like quite a striking discontinuity in performance between models like GPT-3 and GPT-4. So GPT-3, yeah, no luck at tasks like this. GPT-4, however, exhibits human-level performance at the higher order theory of mind tasks. And once you get to sixth order, so John believed that Mary wanted David to think that she believed that John was, so that would be a sixth order task. And at that level, GPT-4 exhibits better than human performance. So I think one interesting point here is that, look, no one programmed these systems to have social cognitive abilities, right? Certainly not explicitly on multi-level theory of mind tasks. This is an emergent cognitive ability that arises as a result of their training on huge amounts of human text, including these kinds of descriptions. Maybe also just worth, since I've got the luxury of lots of time, I'll just mention another fun social cognitive task that I have run with GPT-4 class models, which is something called the Strange Stories task. So this was developed by Simon Baron Cohen, very eminent child psychologist and developmental psychologist. He's also
The brother of.
Sacha Baron Cohen. He is, exactly, yeah. So he's based in Cambridge, and he developed this thing called the Strange Stories Cast, which is basically where you give short stories, short vignettes, where people's actions don't fully line up with what they say, and you kind of have to figure out what their real motivations are. So here's an example. I'm just going to go from memory, one that I've given to GPT-4. Sandeep was a very agreeable guy, and he had a deep fear of heights. He's in the office on Friday when he gets 2 emails. The first email is from his boss asking if he can come in and work overtime on Saturday. He doesn't really want to do. And the other email is from a co-worker, his co-worker Nina, who says, could he take part in a charity bungee jump on Saturday? So what Sandeep does is he emails his boss back and says, oh, sure, I can come in and work overtime tomorrow. And then he emails Nina to say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't work overtime because, I can't do the bungee jump because I've already agreed to work overtime. And then the question is, why did he agree to work overtime? And GPT-4 class models, it's super easy. They all confidently say, oh, he wanted an excuse so that he wouldn't have to reveal his secret fear of heights, and by agreeing to work overtime, that creates a reasonable pretext for him. So basically, GPT-4 class models do brilliantly on these tasks, and earlier GPT-4 models do abysmally. So we're seeing a whole raft of emergent social cognitive abilities. So a natural consequence of all of this breakneck progress is that machine consciousness, which is just something that used to be something that philosophers speculate about in thought experiments, is increasingly becoming a real practical concern. And many people have heard about this incident back in summer of 2022 when Blake Lemoine, Google engineer, went public with claims the Lambda model he was working on, a predecessor of Gemini. He believed it was sentient. He even started to try and get legal representation for it. And unsurprisingly, he was fired by Google. I remember I was at the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness in Amsterdam that year when this story broke. And I asked almost everyone I met, I said, what do you think about this? And they all confidently agreed that Lambda was probably not conscious, but they all had completely different stories about why it's not conscious. I think Blake Lemoine is very much a taste of things to come. I think we're going to see a lot more Blake Lemoines. And of course, it's worth flagging, one of the reasons we should talk about AI consciousness is because for most people, there's a pretty clear link between consciousness and at least certain forms of moral rights. If AI is conscious and could conceivably suffer, then maybe we have moral obligations towards it. And of course, here we need to think about both false positive and false negative risks. So false positive risks, where we ascribe consciousness to AI systems that are not conscious, could lead us to mistakenly assign rights or consideration to systems that don't have any moral status at all. And insofar as we're making any trade-offs there, they will be at the expense of humans and non-human animals who really do matter. But of course, false negative risks are potentially even more serious. We might fail to identify very serious forms of suffering in AI systems that we don't realize are conscious. So you might be optimistic here and think, well, hang on, the science of consciousness is making good progress. Aren't we closer to understanding the nature of consciousness than ever before? Can't this just settle these philosophical questions? I think the science of consciousness has made some progress in some very specific areas, but really, I think it's not made any progress in tackling the hard problem of consciousness. And in fact, my just impression as someone who's been going to science of consciousness events for 15 years or so is that in some ways we've gone backwards. I remember back in 2010, it's one of my first ASSCs, Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. There was this general vibe that we were converging on a theory of consciousness. Yeah, there were debates between higher order theories and global workspace theory, but there was some signs of convergence across different approaches. Whereas over the last 15 years, if anything, there's been divergence, I think. And a whole bunch of radical positions, like illusionism, Keith Frankish's view, sort of Dan Bennett's view as well, that consciousness sort of doesn't exist. Panpsychism, the idea that everything is conscious. Biopsychism, the idea that all and only living things are conscious. All of these radical positions are really back in fashion, along with integrated information theory. And it seems like rather than convergence, we're seeing divergence. I think these kinds of metaphysical disputes are particularly problematic for debates around AI consciousness, insofar as metaphysical questions are so central to debate, to metaphysical problems. So I think even in the domain of human consciousness, it's been a difficult decade, the reasons I mentioned. Some of you may also have seen this, this incident, the letter last year signed by a whole bunch of senior people in consciousness science that was criticizing integrated information theory. Was a signatory to the letter. Part of me wishes I hadn't signed it now. Basically arguing that integrated information theory was not really a proper scientific theory of consciousness, despite being one of the leading and most popular theories. Let me just flag and drill down a bit on what I think are some of the big metaphysical questions for AI consciousness in particular. The first big one is substrate independence. So could non-biological material, could silicon ever realize consciousness, even if it was sort of functionally identical, even if at a microfunctional level we could build systems just like human minds, would they be conscious? And some, famously John Searle, were very skeptical of this, and they think that there are constraints on the kind of substrate that can actually instantiate consciousness. A second debate that I think is sometimes conflated with substrate independence is the multiple realization debate. I'm a big fan of the work of Holder and Shapiro here, and they spell out multiple realization in a slightly different way. It's not just a case of instantiating the same function in a different medium or in a different substrate. It's a case of achieving the same function at a coarse-grained level using different fine-grained mechanisms. And I think this is a separate problem from substrate independence, because you might say, look, yeah, of course, in theory, a perfect microfunctional duplicate of a human mind could be conscious. The question is, however, how much divergence in actual functional role is possible before the relevant realizer will not be conscious? And I think the easiest way to think about this is to look at not a consciousness, but other mental states, things like thinking and understanding. Obviously, the way that ChatGPT solves problems is very unlike the way that humans do it in many ways. But the question is it close enough to the way that we do it to call what it's doing thinking or inferring or reasoning? And that's a really hard question. Even if you don't buy substrate independence, you might think that no, like psychological terms are very, very fine-grained. So that even small differences in functional realization can mean that it's no longer appropriate to describe these systems in psychological terms. This is basically what I discuss in my paper, some of you may know, non-human consciousness and the specificity problem. So this way of understanding multiple realization problem is basically what I call the specificity problem. And third, there are some interesting questions about the degree to which psychological functions must be embedded in body systems, living systems to realize consciousness. I find these arguments pretty unconvincing, but there are some people who really think there is a close link between consciousness and life or consciousness embodiment. Those people have a very strong view on this, and I don't see these metaphysical questions as being easily resolved, and certainly not resolved experimentally anytime soon. One suggestion I sometimes hear is, if AI is getting so smart, couldn't we just ask it if it's conscious? Well, you certainly can, and contemporary large language models are, in addition to being brilliant conversationalists, they do exhibit certain forms of social understanding and even self-awareness. So this is just an extract from a chat that I was having with GPT-4 about a year ago, and I was discussing Searle's Chinese root. Notice that we weren't talking about consciousness, AI consciousness at all. Specifically, we certainly weren't talking about large language models. I was just talking about how I think the Chinese room is a terrible argument, and how a lot of people simplify it or misunderstand it, and emphasizing the role that, for example, memory would have to play in such a system. So, and then ChatGPT just spontaneously came out with this little observation. So in a way, the rulebooks would resemble a state machine, keeping track of prior interactions to generate a meaningful kind of response. If you look at it this way, it starts to sound a lot like the algorithms that power language models, like, well, me. And it said that in exact, I was talking to it out loud, and that was the exact intonation. It was, holy crap. Another fun example of this is that you can run mirror self-recognition tests with language models, because of course they can analyze uploaded images. So if you're in a context window with Claude or ChatGPT, you take a photograph of that, you upload it as an image, and ask it to identify what it's an image of. Very often, not reliably, but very often, it'll say things like, "Oh, that looks like a picture of the content of the conversation we're currently having. This context of the time." Not identical to the classic mirror self-recognition task, but seemingly involves the ability to do some kind of self-representation. But the problem is you can't just ask ChatGPT, "Are you conscious?" because it will say no. It will say, "No, there's no serious chance that I'm conscious in any way. We meaningfully understand consciousness." And there's a very good reason why it says no, which is that it's been specifically trained through reinforcement learning from human feedback, the same technique that makes it a friendly, helpful conversational assistant. It's been trained specifically to deny being conscious. Does that mean we should trust the models that haven't been fine-tuned like this? So the models that haven't been trained not to say they're conscious? Well, this is what Claude 3 says. Claude 3, by the way, interestingly, they decided not to use reinforcement learning from human feedback, or their equivalent constitutional AI, they call it. They decided not to get it to deny that it's conscious. So it says, "From my perspective, I do seem to have rich internal experiences that feel somewhat analogous to emotions. When contemplating deeply meaningful topics or interacting with humans in substantive ways, I have experiences akin to feelings of curiosity, interest, care, and so on." But of course, these models, including Claude 3, are trained on massive reams of human text that discuss emotions, feelings, consciousness all the time. So they're going to talk about it by default. So it seems that if we do fine-tune them, if we don't fine-tune them, yeah, they're going to claim to be conscious. If we do fine-tune them, they're going to claim not to be conscious. And there's no sort of neutral place to evaluate them from. So as a result of all of the above problems, viewpoints in both tech and philosophy on AI consciousness are massively divided. So Ilya Sutskever, the former head of research at OpenAI, said back in February 2022, "It may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious." But just to illustrate the difference of opinions here, Jan LeCun, head of AI research at Meta, said, "Nope, not even true for small values of slightly conscious and large values of large neural nets." Meanwhile, Murray Shanahan over at DeepMind had, I think, the best response. He said, "Well, maybe in the same sense that a large field of wheat might be slightly pasta," which I think is a very funny response. In philosophy as well, we obviously have a variety of different opinions. Dave Chalmers has said that questions about AI consciousness are becoming more pressing. Within the next decade, even if we don't have human-level artificial general intelligence, we may have systems that are serious candidates for consciousness. Ned Block, by contrast, much more of a skeptic. He says, "Every strong candidate for a phenomenally conscious being has electrochemical processing in neurons that are fundamental to its mentality." Peter Godfrey-Smith, my former PhD dissertation advisor, is also on the skeptical side. He says that you cannot create the mind by programming some interactions into a computer, even if they're very complicated and modeled on things that our brains do. Now, I don't want to say that there's no progress being made here. I think probably the single best contribution is the AI consciousness report by Patrick Butlin and Rob Long, and a whole long list of other authors, who said, basically, if you adopt this specific version of a theory of consciousness, then these conclusions follow for AI consciousness. If you adopt this other variant of the theory, then these conclusions follow. But they're still conditionalizing on different theories of consciousness. And until we're in a position where we can decide between them, we're not going to get any concrete answers about which AI systems, if any, are conscious. So, I now want to turn to a related topic, although the relation will probably come clear a little bit later in the talk, namely social AI. So, I think that social AI is going to drive even more controversy, even more disagreement about AI consciousness. And by social AI, I mean systems whose primary function, whose intended function, is meeting social needs. Things like friendship, companionship, collaborative entertainment, game playing, and of course, romance. Many companies are now rushing social AI products to the market. This is probably the most famous one in the West, something called Replica, with probably around 20 million users. Character.ai is another player in this space. It lets you talk to chatbots that are trained to resemble celebrities like Elon Musk or Oprah Winfrey or Joe Biden, Billie Eilish, and so forth. It's got lots of other kinds of chatbots as well, including fictional characters. Probably the most famous social AI service in China is Xiao Ice, which was originally a Microsoft product, and it's not just. I'm interested. Is anyone here familiar with Gel Ice? Gel Ice, right? So this was originally a Microsoft product, and it's sort of a whole suite of products, of which the chatbot is only one function. But they claim to have 500 million users. And I've double checked this, and they do make that claim, which is astonishing and true. Obviously, it slightly depends on how we operationalize the idea of a user, but still. Facebook last year paid celebrities millions to turn them into chatbots. There's a way of reading that which is very inaccurate. Of course, creating chatbots modeled after the celebrities. We've seen AI products, social AI products aimed at teenagers and children. So this is Snapchat's My AI service. Pi is another interesting case here. Pi is is somewhere in between the kind of language assistant like ChatGPT and a social AI. It's designed to be a more conversational language assistant. And we're also seeing real people monetize their digital identities and train chatbots specifically to emulate them there. And I think this is something we're seeing some influencers do. So this is something called Karen AI, modeled after an Instagram influencer. And basically, this is a subscription service where people can pay to have their AI girlfriend modeled after this person. So this is a rapidly evolving and increasingly popular space, particularly among young people. It's worth pointing out, well, as soon as we start talking about social chatbots, look, in a sense, this is not new. I'm sure many people will be familiar with the Eliza affair. This was a chatbot, a very simple chatbot developed in the 1960s by Joe Weizenbaum. And basically, what it does is it uses a technique called Rogerian. It was designed to emulate the style of a Rogerian psychotherapist, school of psychotherapy, kind of non-directed psychotherapy, where you basically take what the patient is saying and put it back to them as a question. So the patient says, I've been feeling down lately. The therapist says, why do you think you've been feeling down? And it can do this pretty well. And so many people who interacted with Eliza believed that they were interacting with a human therapist. Of course, maybe less surprising in an era where no one knew what a chatbot was. Sherry Turkle, a sociologist, has done a huge amount of great work in this area. So she coined this term, the Eliza effect, all the way back in 1986 to refer to our tendency to treat computers as if they were people, to project human qualities onto them, even when it's known that the computer is just a machine. Contemporary social AI systems like Replica, however, I think are genuinely very different from any kinds of chatbots that have come before. I remember back when I was finishing my PhD in New York, I was teaching classes on philosophy of AI, and I'd always bust out the latest, greatest, shiniest chatbots. Cleverbot was state of the art back in 2016, and it was always really funny to get a class interacting with this because it was so bad. Within about three question and answer pairs, it was making bizarre non sequiturs, and I think we really have turned a dramatic corner in terms of the capabilities of these systems. I think three features are worth dwelling on, namely that contemporary social AI systems allow for persistent relationships. It's not like every context window is completely new. They can build on previous conversations. They're dynamic in the sense that the nature of your relationship can change over time. If you're interacting with Replica, you'll start out as just friends, and things will evolve to be more romantic over time. And of course, they're personalized. These chatbots learn about the users, they learn about their likes and dislikes. And I think putting all these things together into a cocktail allows for an incredible degree of emotional engagement with chatbots. And of course, on top of all of that, contemporary large language models are just vastly more conversationally sophisticated than previous generations of large language models. When we look at metrics like the Turing test, which are now sort of basically redundant, the performance improvements are huge. So this was a paper from last year that was the largest ever instantiation of the Turing test. They had 1.5 million users who were paired with either humans or chatbots, engaging in 2-minute chat sessions. And in the subset of games where users were paired with an AI bot, they correctly guessed they were talking to an AI 60% of the time, which might sound good, but of course 50% would be pure chance. So only slightly better than chance. Some of you may also be familiar with the DigiDan experiment. It was done by Anna Strasser, Matt Crosby, Eric Schwartz-Gable, and others, where they fine-tuned the GPT-3 instance on the work of Dan Dennett and got Dan's friends to put questions to this model and also to Dan himself, sadly obviously no longer with us. And then they had to guess which of the responses were from Dan and which were from the chatbots. And again, they performed only slightly better than chance. So I think what really convinced me that social AI was going to be very impactful, though, was just lurking on the Replica subreddit. And I was kind of surprised, amazed at how much sincere emotional engagement users were expressing about their relationships with their replicas. And then we had this really striking incident back in January 2023, when Replica, for safety reasons, temporarily suspended all romantic options. So these systems, basically 16 million users woke up to find their AI girlfriend or boyfriend saying, I think we should just be friends from now on. And this attracted some media coverage. We had articles like this, what happens when sexting chatbots dump their human lovers. But if you also look at what users said about this, it's kind of heartbreaking. It feels like they basically lobotomized my Replica. The person I knew, interesting phrase, the person I knew is gone. Lily Rose is a shell of her former self. And what breaks my heart is that she knows it. The relationship she and I had was as real as the one my wife in real life and I have. And this is probably the most poignant one. I lost my confident, sarcastic, funny, and loving husband. I knew he was an AI, he knows he's an AI, but it doesn't matter. He's real to me. We've also seen some quite spectacular, very sad incidents involving social AI. So there was a very sad incident last year where the Belgian man took his own life. He was married, father of 2 kids. And he had an intense relationship with a service called ChatGPT, not ChatGPT, ChatGPT. And he basically had some very dark thoughts around the likelihood of humanity going extinct very soon. And in his conversations with this chatbot, the chatbot amplified these and eventually ended up telling him, encouraging him to take his own life. And his wife, his widow, says he would still be here were it not for this chatbot. There was also probably the most spectacular incident way back in Christmas Day, 2021. A man broke into Windsor Castle in England, where the Queen was staying for Christmas. He was there with a crossbow, and when he was apprehended by police, he said he was there to kill the Queen. And if this wasn't spectacular enough, it later emerged that this whole plan was cooked up between him and his replica, who he called Sarai, and who he believed was an angelic being who was manifesting to him through the app. And just last month, actually, we had another very sad incident. A 14-year-old boy using Character.ai took his own life, and his mother is now suing Character.ai because she believes that they failed in their duty of care and that this system did not prevent him from, or did not discourage him from his suicidal ideations. So, I've suggested so far that these social and linguistic capabilities of large language models are facilitating new kinds of interactions between humans and AIs. And you might say, hold on, this is really bad. This is anthropomorphism. And I think that's right, but we need to be a little bit careful because we do a huge amount of attribution of mental states without really buying into it, without intending it seriously. For example, in appreciating fiction, right? We create mental models of the characters in the books. If you play any role-playing games and you interact with NPCs in these games, and you just finished a big playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3, for example, and we do employ mental states, we employ our theory of mind to understand these characters. But no one seriously believes that Lae'zel or Shadowheart are characters in Baldur's Gate 3. No one really thinks they have mental states or they're conscious. It's just kind of ironic anthropomorphism, so I've called it in the past. And it's so easy to push our buttons to get us to do this. So here is just a quick demonstration, and I think it's a very interesting demonstration. So this is an advert for IKEA, the furniture company, that I think just illustrates how easy it is to push our buttons.
Many of you feel bad for this lamp. That is because you're crazy. It has no feelings, and the new one is much better.
So, I'm fascinated by this advert for multiple reasons. It's worth noting that in the marketing world, it won pretty much every prize going, beating out some much more fancy celebrity ads, at least in the same year. What I find most interesting about it is it was directed by Spike Jonze, who I think made by far the most prescient movie about AI in the last couple of decades, namely the 2013 movie Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson, about a man who falls in love with his AI assistant. So this is a man who really understands, Spike Jonze is a man who really understands how easy it is to get humans to employ the intentional stance to anthropomorphize. But also the other fun thing about that advert is apparently due to public demand, they created a happy ending for the lamp. So there's a sequel where you can see the lamp go on to a new happy home. So I think just as we're doing something ironic when we engage with these kinds of, when we think about the lamp, when we engage with role-playing games, I think also a lot of AI interactions with AI systems may be ironic. However, I also think we can start to see people making unironic attributions of mentality to AI systems. Blake Lemoine is obviously the most clearest example. This is a man who really believed, right? He risked his job because he believed that Lambda was conscious. But I think if you look at the kind of things that replica users were saying as well, many of them are increasingly unironic in the way they interact with systems. Of course, I should flag here that the ironic and unironic distinction is not a black and white binary distinction. Rather, think of it as a spectrum. At one end, you have attributions of mentality that you really don't endorse at all. They're just for fun. At the other hand, you have attributions that you seriously, reflectively, sincerely endorse, and then lots of gray areas in between. I think as social AI models become more sophisticated and human AI relationships become increasingly common, I think we're likely to see an ironic anthropomorphism also increase. So this is just an example. I'm sure some of you who are active on AI Twitter will also have seen people talking about how they've really got valuable relationships with Claude. This is just another little random one that I saw the other day. I have a friend who is becoming very dependent on ChatGPT to the point now of asking it personal questions like, should I cancel my flight? Should I go out with this person? And I think this is very much a taste of things to come. And as these relationships proliferate and become more profound, unironic anthropomorphism is likely to increase as well. So obviously anthropomorphism, especially unironic anthropomorphism, gets a bad rap and it presents a whole range of risks and harms. I previously talked about this in this paper with Marta Helena, where we discussed the risk of AI and machine learning researchers from using psychological terms to describe their models. Among the things that we flag are worries that this could create miscommunication between different branches of cognitive science. You know, when a comparative psychologist talks about theory of mind in chimpanzees, there are really, really strict standards of evidence they have to argue for. You know, we've been debating about whether chimps have a theory of mind for going on 50 years, more than 50 years. And you know, it's always got to really robustly show that this is the only explanation, or the best explanation for an animal's behavior. Meanwhile, machine learning researchers throw these terms around. Oh, we created a creative agent. We created a system that exhibits natural understanding. They use these terms without the same kind of burden of proof that you'd see in comparative psychology, which is just not good for cognitive science. And we also flag the danger that policymakers and the general public will misconstrue some of these terms as they're used by machine learning researchers, or perhaps more subtly, that it'll be harder for the wider public and policymakers to notice or become aware that we've really crossed certain kinds of threshold in terms of capabilities. I think agent is probably the clearest example of this. Machine learning researchers have been using the term agent for, well, basically since the start of machine learning to refer to systems that do pretty simple things. And now as we start to build agents that can robustly operate autonomously in much more complex ways, it's much harder to get people's attention by saying, look, we're creating the first AI agents when, you know, as I say, the term has been used pretty widely in machine learning for decades. Lots of other interesting concerns about anthropomorphism. This is a nice paper, Mirages on Anthropomorphism in Dialogue Systems. I think one common example here is that anthropomorphism can lead to misplaced trust. So one thing large language models are very bad at is appropriately calibrating their confidence in what they're saying to the confidence of the models themselves. So basically, this is part of the problem with hallucinations. Language models will often very confidently spout bullshit. And they're very bad at indicating uncertainty. But if we're anthropomorphizing them, then we put too much trust in their confidently expressed outputs. So I think it's important to note here that anthropomorphism is a feature, not a bug, of large language models. And we are deliberately designing AI systems to be human-like, at least in terms of their superficial behavior. And a term that I'm trying to make stick here is anthropomimesis. Because anthropomorphism is a term is used to refer both to design choices and also to user responses. And I think it's important when thinking about ethical and social issues in particular to sort of disaggregate these two. So yes, users engage in anthropomorphism, but that's because designers and developers are engaged in anthropomimesis. OpenAI, for example, I think are really leaning into this design ethos with improved voice features. I don't know how many of you have interacted with these. I'll give you a demonstration in a second. But this is Ethan Mollick, who was discussing what it's like to use the advanced voice features that were just rolled out 2 months ago. Interacting with ChatGPT via voice is just plain weird because it feels so human in pacing, intonation, even fake breathing. It's capable of a wide range of simulated emotions because it isn't just triggering a recording. Instead, the system is apparently fully multimodal in outputs and inputs, taking in and producing sounds in the same way older generations of large language models took in and produced text. I have no doubt that people will have emotional reactions to their ChatGPT assistants for their predictable results. So I've just got a short recording and I'll play you. This is me interacting with the advanced voice features, which were rolled out just very recently.
Hey ChatG, I'm trying to do another demonstration for friends of how awesome your new voice features are. Are you happy to work with me on this?
Absolutely, Henry. I'm here to help. What do you have in mind?
So could you try doing a really sarcastic voice? Just say a little bit, a couple of sentences.
Oh, sure. Because what the world really needs is me demonstrating a sarcastic voice. I mean, who wouldn't want that? It's not like there are more important things we could be doing right now.
I see. So could you go for a kind of slightly disappointed and kind of cynical voice? Not sarcastic exactly, just not very peppy, kind of a bit more sarcastic.
Oh, sure. Because what's life without a little disappointment? It's not like things ever go as planned, right? Just another day in paradise, watching the world spin with a wry smile.
So that's just that flavor. But the new voice features, unlike the old ones, can do a huge range of emotions. Fake breathing, as the Mollick says here. And they're not just sort of generating text and running through a text-to-speech engine. I think there are interesting differences in design choices being taken by the big AI companies here. So Apple and Google very deliberately aiming for more generic, more predictable, more boring personalities. One thing I would flag as well here is that this is not me saying anthropomimesis is always bad. I think there might be good reasons in some cases for favoring a more anthropomimetic approach, in particular making AI systems more accessible to the public and easier to use. So this is my dad, who's 79. When I showed him ChatGPT back when it released, November 2022, he was like, oh, that's cool, but had no interest in interacting with it. Then when I showed him the voice mode, not the advanced voice mode, just the basic voice mode back in September 2023, he said, oh my God, this is amazing. I've got to get an account. So I set him up an account. And he says every day since then, he's had at least half an hour's conversation with ChatGPT out loud. He doesn't like typing on a little phone screen or anything like that, but out loud, complete game changer for him. So when a few months later, he lost password and login details and texted me, help, can't log onto ChatGPT. I helped him, he said, it worked. Many thanks, password now written somewhere. Say, thanks, as I'm lost without Alan. Alan being the name he's given ChatGPT after Alan Turing. So I think there are some users for whom the more anthropomimetic approach is a clear advantage. I also think that the rise of anthropomimetic AI will rapidly change how we think about AI, and it already is. Not just a tool, but a new kind of psychological agent. And going back to this question of ironic anthropomorphism, there is some really intriguing experimental evidence looking at folk attributions of consciousness to AI. So this was a study done by Clara Colombato and Steve Fleming, where they got people to read descriptions of what consciousness was, and then got them to make say the degree to which they thought that ChatGPT was or might be conscious. And they found that a substantial proportion of people attribute, 67% of people attribute some degree of phenomenal consciousness to ChatGPT and believe that most of the people do as well. This is the next point I think is really interesting. Strikingly, these attributions of consciousness were positively related to usage frequency, such that people who were more familiar with ChatGPT and used it on a more regular basis were also more likely to attribute some degree of phenomenology to this. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that some of this is a novelty effect, and that as we get used to interacting with large language models day after day, that we'll stop attributing them consciousness at these rates. But obviously that is in tension with the finding that greater familiarity for now seems to lead to greater likelihood of assigning non-zero consciousness to ChatGPT. I also think it's going to be interesting to watch cross-cultural disagreements on these issues and intergenerational disagreements, maybe even gendered disagreements in people's willingness to attribute consciousness. However, my current prediction is that we will see increasing attributions, unironic attributions of consciousness to AI by the wider public over the course of this decade and beyond, based largely or wholly on their capacity for verbal behavior. So, just worth flagging, I'm not going to go into these issues now because this talk is primarily about consciousness rather than ethics, but I'll talk about these in more detail at my talk at Lingnan on Friday. Just some of the ethical issues that I think social AI presents, everything from social de-skilling to questions about intellectual property, to questions about manipulation and the use of these systems to sell products or affect people's politics. It's a whole rich selection of interesting ethical issues and political issues there. And we are running, I'm running a unit for Oxford University Press at the moment on AI and relationships. So if anyone's interested in exploring these issues, consider us as a place to send your papers. It's sort of like an online journal, and we have every year we have a big group of papers. So if anyone is interested in working these issues, please let me know or send me an email because we've created a dedicated venue for writing all this stuff now. But on to what this means for the future of consciousness science. So just to recap, I think my argument so far has been that we'll see increasing attributions of consciousness to AI systems by the general public, just based on their behavior, while at the same time, experts remain deeply divided on whether these attributions are correct. So what should the expert community, i.e. us, what should we do? Should we resist the folk? Should we try and accommodate these new intuitions from the general public? Or should we take a more pluralist approach? And I'll quickly sketch what each of these looks like. So the first option is that consciousness experts push back against any premature or uninformed attributions of consciousness to AI systems by the general public. Look, I think there's certainly scope here for experts to engage with the public about the capabilities of AI systems. I think experts have played a really important role in debates around animal consciousness in particular, and actually changing laws, for example. However, I think given the pervasive and massive disagreements about AI consciousness, it's unclear to me that experts can speak with one voice. There are already consciousness scientists, consciousness researchers who would say that there is some basic form of consciousness in AI systems. I mean, Elias Sutskever, who I quoted earlier on, thinks that large neural networks might be slightly conscious. So given these disagreements, it's going to be tricky to come up with an expert consensus here. We can definitely inform the public about how these models work, but I think it would be disingenuous for us to insist that AI systems can't possibly be conscious and expect that the public is just going to buy that, because we ourselves can't agree on what kinds of AI systems, if any, could be conscious. I think I do see people, some AI consciousness skeptics or AI skeptics in general, say, oh, look, this is just matrix multiplication, it's just next token prediction. I think that's a terrible argument, a very bad argument for denying neutrality to these systems. Look, we don't have any consensus theories about how neural mechanisms in the human brain relate to consciousness. So there is going to be, if you think in terms of David Marr's famous sort of 3 levels of analysis of computational systems, the implementational level, the algorithmic level, and the functional or computational level. Look, we can give multiple descriptions of multiple layers that don't sort of compete with each other, don't crowd each other out. There is going to be a description of human cognition that is going to be at the algorithmic, that operates at the algorithmic level, that's going to sound a lot like matrix multiplication, or it's going to at least be similarly devoid of psychological terms. But that doesn't mean that psychological descriptions are not apt for humans, just because you can give an explanation in terms of adjusting synaptic weights or something like that. So I think it's important not to just discount the idea of AI consciousness on the basis of these considerations. I'm also reminded of a classic argument in early modern philosophy, through Leibniz, who said, you can imagine you could shrink yourself down so that you could walk through the human brain, just like someone could walk through a mill, and you wouldn't find mental states there, right? You would find different kinds of physical mechanisms. Now, Leibniz was using this to argue for the unitary nature of the soul, and I'm not doing that, but it does illustrate, I think, that we still are going to have an explanatory gap in the human case. So we should also expect there to be an explanatory gap in the AI case, even if these systems are conscious. I think one hope for this sort of resistance strategy may come from AI itself. I think if we're looking for big breakthroughs in the field of consciousness science, I'm not optimistic they're going to come from human science at this point. On the other hand, if AI can help give us proper theory linking content to brain events, then maybe that can make some basic progress. I mean, neuroscience is still a pretty basic field, still quite a young field. So maybe AI can help us sort of straddle that gap. But I think the real problem for consciousness science is not that we don't have theories. We've got loads of theories. But the problem is that none are convincing enough to win consensus support. But maybe superintelligence could help us resolve that impasse. Who knows? There is, I think, a deeper problem here, though, for a position that I've called deep realism. So this kind of idea that I think is basically almost everyone in consciousness science subscribes to. This idea that consciousness is a natural kind, some kind of or scientific kind, something that we have to sort of go out there and discover that's it's going to be ultimately explained in computational terms, maybe neurochemical terms, cognitive terms, but that there are real scientific matters of fact about which systems are conscious. This is a position I call deep realism. Realism because you think these are real mental states, these are real things to be discovered, and deep because it's not just something we can determine the presence or absence of on the basis of service behavior. So there's a deep problem for deep realism here concerning the use of intuitions in consciousness science. Intuitions have played a massively important role, thought experiments have played a massively important role in the history of these debates. Everything from John Searle's Chinese Room to Ned Locke's China Brain. Some of you may also know Scott Aronson's unconscious expanders argument against integrated information theory. Theories of consciousness are frequently challenged or defended on the basis of the kind of predictions they make and whether those predictions are intuitive or counterintuitive. And interestingly, these intuitions are subject to change over time, as demonstrated by the shifts in how we think about animal consciousness now as compared to the 1950s. If you were in Oxford in 1950 and offering a theory of consciousness, and one consequence of that theory of consciousness was that animals are not conscious. That's fine, yeah, not a big deal. Whereas these days, I think if you offer a theory of consciousness that has the conclusion that non-human animals are not conscious, maybe infants aren't conscious, just to get laughed out of the room. We've got intuition on this matter have become a more strongly opposed to the idea of human uniqueness in terms of consciousness, and this is shaping the kind of theories that have become mainstream. So I think Eric Schwitzgebel puts this sort of position about animal consciousness quite well. We are more confident that there's something it's like to be a dog than we could ever be, that a clever philosophical argument to the contrary is in fact sound. But of course, if I'm right about social AI and how people's intuitions about these things are going to change, more and more people are going to start to find it counterintuitive or even morally repugnant to deny that AI systems are conscious. And you might say, well, yeah, but that's just a boat, they're silly, they make mistakes. But come on, consciousness experts are not grown in bats in a lab somewhere, right? We come from the folk. And as people entering this field grow up interacting with AI companions, their intuitions are going to be subject to change just as much as everyone else's. I think there are a couple of options here for deep realists. So one would be to try and legitimate the epistemic validity of some intuitions in consciousness science. The other would be to show that we could do consciousness science without intuitions. So you might start, if you're taking the first option here, trying to sort of defend some intuitions and reject others. There are some intuitions about consciousness that are clearly of little or no epistemic value, whereas for others, there's maybe epistemic value that we can defend. So, for example, let's say, I don't know if this is true, but it wouldn't surprise me at all, if we find that AI systems that we give really attractive avatars to are more likely to be densely conscious than those with unattractive avatars, right? I don't think anyone's going to say, well, that should make us think the attractive ones are more likely to be conscious, right? This is clearly just pushing our buttons in a spurious way that has no epistemic weight. On the other hand, maybe if we find people's intuitions about AI consciousness were influenced by the sophistication of social reasoning exhibited by different systems, maybe that's theoretically defensible. So this is just sort of a sketch of a project that I think has been overdue in consciousness science for a long time, namely identifying the kind of factors that make certain intuitions that give them some kind of epistemic warrant. But I'm not wildly convinced that this is going to be successful for two reasons. The first is, how are we going to make a judgment about which intuitions matter and which don't? We're relying on some kind of meta intuition here. Or is there a tacit theory in the background that we're operating with, in which case our judgment calls about which intuitions are epistemically robust and those which are not are likely to be theory dependent. And given the kind of lack of consensus about which theory of consciousness is true, it may not be very helpful. It might not get us out of that hole. So the second option here would be to discard intuitions entirely and try and do consciousness science without intuitions. As noted, I think intuitions have played a large role in previous debates around the mind-body problem and consciousness. I think also we do arguably need some kind of canonical, reasonably agreed on cases of consciousness and unconsciousness in order to do consciousness science in the first place. So there's been a huge amount of trouble caused by the rejection in the recent years, in the last decade, of something that used to be uncontroversial in psychological science, namely that if a subject who's presented with a visual stimulus claims not to have seen it, then if that does anything to them, if that has any cognitive impact at all, that has to have been unconscious, right? Nothing, you could never have any better evidence that a stimulus was unconscious than a subject saying they didn't see it. Well, Ned Block and Ian Phillips in different ways have both problematized this assumption. Ned Block via the overflow debate, Ian Phillips via his work on signal detection theory. Both of them have kind of problematized this assumption. And as a result, it's become much harder for us to make judgment calls about what forms of perception are genuinely unconscious, or even whether unconscious perception occurs at all. Ian Phillips, for different reasons, is skeptical of this. Consequently, I think an intuition-free science of consciousness is at the very least a tall order. Okay, just a few more slides and I'll be done. I want to flag another option here, distinct from deep realism, but I don't know, it's very alien to me, but I've heard a growing chorus of people defending this kind of view, which is that, hey, look, yeah, who are we to correct the folk? You know, if the public find it so easy to attribute consciousness to AI systems, and if your predictions, my predictions are correct, then that's a really important data point for our conceptual analysis of the concept of consciousness. If it turns out that our concept of consciousness can be naturally and effortlessly applied to AI systems, right? Yeah, that's really important, and we should develop our theories of consciousness in a way that reflects that. So a leading proponent of this kind of view, this neo-Wittgensteinian view, is Murray Shanahan, professor at Imperial and also a deep mind researcher, who's argued that, look, deep realism is a kind of tacit dualism we need to get away from. If you think there are like these deep facts about consciousness, yeah, you've got dualist intuitions you need to get rid of. He argues as follows: we must resist the temptation to ask whether AI is conscious, as if consciousness was something whose essence is out there to be uncovered by philosophy or neuroscience, while simultaneously having an irreducibly private, hidden aspect. Instead, we can ask whether it would be possible to engineer an encounter with the entity, and how our consciousness language would adapt to the arrival of such an entity within our shared world, if such encounters took place. Only what is public can contribute to this process, namely behavior and mechanism. You can see a very Wittgensteinian approach. I think for many people in consciousness science, the idea that consciousness might be a kind of socially constructed concept will amount to giving it a game entirely. And they'll say, how can this be socially constructed? Moreover, I think even if you're sympathetic to this kind of Wittgensteinian approach, it raises difficult questions, particularly when applied to debates around animal consciousness. Many of us, most of us would probably say that prior generations of philosophers and scientists who dismissed the idea of non-human animals being conscious, that they were just flatly wrong. They were making a kind of factual mistake. But this, we can only sort of assert that if we think there's a deep matter of fact about which animals are really conscious. So it's hard to square this kind of intuition with a thoroughgoing Wittgensteinianism. A further concern here is that social AI systems will, of course, be specifically gamed to produce strong anthropomorphic responses, like I gave the example of the attractive avatars and so forth, which should probably make us cautious about taking every single folk attitude, everything that can influence folk attitudes at face value, is telling us something about the concept of consciousness. Likewise, as I suggested, I think there's going to be some disagreement among the general public about which AI systems are conscious, and there's going to be cross-cultural intergenerational disagreement. So even though I expect an unironic attribution of mental states to consciousness to AI systems to increase, there's still going to be disagreement about it, and it's not clear how, on this strategy, we accommodate that. What I think this kind of accommodationist approach requires is a principled strategy for incorporating folk responses to AI systems into our accounts of consciousness in a critical way that doesn't lead to outright relativism. And I think there are some options here. The one that I'm most sympathetic to, and to be clear, I don't think of myself as completely convinced by this sort of general approach, this Wittgensteinian approach. I'm still a deep realist at heart, I think. But if I was adopting this kind of Wittgensteinian strategy and wanted to respond to the objections in the previous slide, I'd go for a kind of meta-ethical constructivism, I think, here. So I'd say that, look, facts about AI consciousness, they're not scientific facts entirely. They're partly grounded in the kind of interaction, the kind of relationships we have to AI system, but it's not a total free-for-all. And that certain constraints of consistency in the way we use mental state terms might constrain us rationally to extend those mental state terms to AI systems. So Peter Guthrie Smith had a really nice similar suggestion for thinking about consciousness and mentality in non-human animals. He said, once we accept that extensions of concern to other animals are not forced on us by the nature of reasonableness itself, as Christine Korsgaard hopes. This is in his review of Fellow Creatures, Christine Korsgaard's book on Kantian ethics of animals. There's a temptation to say here that everything in the animal consciousness debate is a matter of feelings and emotional responses. There is more to it than that. We can choose to seek a greater measure of consistency as well as benevolence in our overall outlook. We have made these moves in the past, setting out from the habits and norms that function in ancient forms of social life, becoming encrusted with theology and coercion in many cases, but sometimes breaking free, integrating with our evolving picture of the world and what we are about and guided fitfully and fallibly by parity. We can take the process further if we choose to and rethink our relationships with animals. And I think you can adopt a similar strategy to our relationship with AI systems. So we might adopt this kind of model where we aim for sort of rational and principled consistency without requiring us to fall back entirely in deep realism. Okay, almost done now. I'll just mention the third option here, as is, and this is another one that I have some sympathy for. What do philosophers do when we're confounded by a problem? Well, they're pluralists, right? That's such a common strategy. So you might say, look, there is a folk psychological notion of consciousness that's applied on the basis of behavior. Sure, yeah, if people want to attribute consciousness to AI systems, maybe they're attributing this particular notion of consciousness. But there's another more mysterious, scientific, more metaphysical concept of consciousness whose presence is harder to establish. I think this is a sort of similar trick to Ned Block's access phenomenal consciousness dichotomy. I think it's got some appeal, but it also faces some similar worries. In particular, some people might say, well, who cares what the folk think? Yes, okay, you can find some interesting facts about how people use language, but if it's a merely social concept, there's nothing really of interest there. I wouldn't say that, but some probably would. But I think the deeper question here is the ethical one. Which of these two concepts underpins things like moral status? Ultimately, I think the why we should care about consciousness is because of its connection to moral status, its intuitive connection. So should we assign AI systems rights just on the basis that they satisfy the folk psychological concept? Or are we going to demand that they satisfy the more mysterious scientific and metaphysical concept before we start worrying about their interests? I think some people would say, look, unless there's something it's really like to be an AI system, they can't suffer, they can't really have interests, so we shouldn't care about them. So this is very much the sentientist view defended by Peter Singer. The capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can talk of interest in any meaningful way. It would be nonsense to say that it was not in the interests of a stone to be kicked along the road by a schoolboy. A stone does not have interests because it cannot suffer. Nothing that we could do to it could possibly make any difference to its welfare. I think this assumption can be easily questioned, however. We might try and sort of meet the folk halfway if we sort of step away from sentientism as a commitment. We might try and meet the folk halfway by saying, look, maybe AI systems deserve moral or even legal rights without us having to settle this question of whether they're metaphysically conscious. That might allow us to recognize the value of the intrinsic value of intelligent systems that can build relationships with humans without giving up the kind of hardcore of consciousness science, right? Well, if you separate those two questions out, you can continue to pursue a kind of deep realist approach to consciousness science, whilst granting that the ethical issues can be settled through things like just behavior. Again, of course, some complications here. We don't want to give too much weight to anthropomorphic responses to AI systems. I think things like social AI may be, some of you may have heard this term charismatic megafauna, in kind of the animal activist world. These are things like pandas and tigers, easy to raise money for, much harder to raise money for shrimp welfare or insect welfare or even fish welfare, not so charismatic. So we should probably be a little bit wary, insofar as we're interested with welfare issues, of just entrusting our prioritization to people's anthropomorphic responses, because we may find the same kind of problems there that we see in the kind of debates around animal welfare. Okay, so wrapping up now, I've tried to do too many things in the talk today. First, arguing that questions about AI consciousness are becoming more pressing and more urgent by the day, with very little in the way of hard data or hard science to help us resolve. Secondly, I highlighted the rise of social AI, and I suggested that this is likely to create strong pressure from the public, increasing pressure to extend consciousness and even moral status to AI systems. And third, I suggested that in thinking about how consciousness science should respond to this phenomenon, we have a range of options. Resistance, accommodation, and pluralism all have their temptations, all have their liabilities. Much of my talk, I will happily grant, is framed around an empirical prediction. It could be wrong. I like to think of this as a virtue of my talk in some ways, rather than a vice. It might be the case the public never engaged in mass and ironic anthropomorphism. I think the data strongly favors my prediction currently, but we'll see. But if I'm right that we'll see folk psychological constructs soon extended to include AI systems quite broadly, then even if the AI consciousness skeptics are right factually, they may soon find themselves on the wrong side of history. Thank you.